In this video, I want to talk about the United States and its foreign military bases. This is why I have my globe here. So, from the estimates that I read online, the United States has between 750 to 800 foreign military bases across 80 countries around the planet. And that is the most amount of military bases any country has, foreign military bases. And in this video, though, we're going to be focusing on this hemisphere, the Western Hemisphere, and the foreign military bases the United States has in the Americas. This video is just going to be an overview of the foreign military bases that the United States has in Latin America, in the Western Hemisphere. To do a detailed history on each base in one video is too much information, and that would take up too much time. So this is just an overview of them. Each military base really does deserve its own video. In the Caribbean, the United States has military bases in two countries. That would be Cuba and in Puerto Rico. And the island of Puerto Rico has been a United States territory / colony since 1898. And in Cuba, the United States has had the Guantanamo Bay Naval Base since 1903. In Central America, the United States has only one major military presence, and that would be in the Central American country, Honduras, where the United States has had an air base since 1983 called the Soto Cano Air Base in central Honduras. So now I'm going to give a brief overview of each of these different American military bases in the hemisphere, starting with the Guantanamo Bay Naval Base in Cuba. The Guantanamo Bay Naval Base was the first foreign military base for the United States back in 1903. The background was, after the Spanish-American War of 1898, the United States did an occupation in both Cuba and Puerto Rico. Cuba and Puerto Rico were the last two colonies of the Spanish in the Americas until 1898, when the United States went to war with the Spanish and took Cuba and Puerto Rico away from them and kicked the Spanish out. And Puerto Rico was made into a U.S. territory, and Cuba was more or less treated as a U.S. territory. So the United States began an occupation of Cuba after driving out the Spanish, and the United States, in fact, did several interventions and occupations of Cuba from the years 1898 to 1922. During that first occupation, from 1898 to 1903, the United States basically gave Cuba a pretty raw deal that they had to allow the United States access to a naval base. And in 1903, the construction was completed of the Guantanamo Bay Naval Base, which has been America's oldest foreign military base. So the Guantanamo Bay Naval Base has a bunch of, U.S. naval personnel there, and the United States managed to hold on to it even after the Cuban Revolution of the 1950s, when Fidel Castro and the communists were able to overthrow Fulgencio Batista, the U.S.-backed dictator, and an anti-American communist government took power, and the United States, despite severing relations with Cuba and putting an embargo on Cuba, still managed to hold on to its naval base, the Guantanamo Bay Naval Base in Cuba. And it's been a constant source of frustration ever since between the communist government of Cuba and the United States. And the United States continued having the base, and there is a border, a demilitarized zone ever since the 1960s, separating the naval base from the rest of Cuba. And in the last 20 years, the Guantanamo Bay Naval Base ended up taking on a more sinister role when the War on Terror began after the 9/11 attacks. Since 2002, the United States has used the Guantanamo Bay Naval Base as a detention camp to imprison captured terrorist suspects, where they have been tortured and interrogated. And this still goes on to this day. So the other major American military presence in the Caribbean would be Puerto Rico. As stated earlier, the island of Puerto Rico has been a United States territory / colony since 1898, when the United States forced the Spanish out in the Spanish-American War and took Puerto Rico as a U.S. colony. And the United States has several military bases in the island of Puerto Rico, including Fort Buchanan, which began in 1923. The United States has Coast Guard stations in Puerto Rico, naval stations, air bases, and so forth. There's a very large American military presence on the island of Puerto Rico, and at times there's been clashes and tensions between the Puerto Rican population and American military bases, such as the island of Vieques, but that deserves its own separate video. And to this day, Puerto Rico has not been able to achieve any type of independence. It remains a U.S. colony, and there's still many debates on that to this day. The American military bases in Cuba and Puerto Rico have served the United States military in many of its invasions and interventions in the Caribbean. These include the U.S. invasions of Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and Cuba. The United States invaded Haiti at least 3 times, in 1915, 1994, and 2004. And the United States also carried out 2 military invasions in the Dominican Republic in 1916, and then again in 1965. And the United States carried out a military invasion of the island of Grenada in 1983. And the United States military in Puerto Rico and the Guantanamo Bay Naval Base in Cuba helped bring the U.S. military closer to intervene in these different Caribbean islands over the decades. The last base on this list of the United States in Latin America would be the Soto Cano Air Base in Honduras. The history of it goes back to 1983, when the United States made an agreement with the Honduran government at the time to have an American military presence in their country. At the time in the 1980s, there were civil wars going on in Central America, such as in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Nicaragua, and Honduras is right there in the middle of those countries. And the United States decided in the 80s to establish an American military presence in Honduras to further intervene in these civil wars that the U.S. was very much involved in. And in particular, Nicaragua. The U.S. at the time in the 1980s was trying to destabilize and overthrow the socialist Sandinista government in Nicaragua, led by Daniel Ortega in the 80s. And Honduras was, at the time, the government of Honduras on board with that idea and gladly gave the U.S. what it wanted. The Nicaraguan Contras were able to have bases in Honduras and launch attacks across the border in Nicaragua. U.S. soldiers stationed in Honduras at the time were giving aid and help to the Nicaraguan Contras and supporting and giving military aid and training to the security forces of Honduras, who at the time were engaged in death squad activity on their own citizens. And even after the 80s, the U.S. decided to keep having a military presence in Honduras, which exists to this day. And to this day, Honduras is a very violent, unstable country and poor, and a lot of migrants come from Honduras, and there isn't a lot of stability despite 40 years of an American military presence in that country. And one of the other things, the U.S. says it's there to fight drug trafficking, and yet so many of the Honduran security forces who are trained by the United States are caught over and over again participating in drug trafficking, and many of Honduras' political leadership who are allies with the United States 40 years later. That's what there is to show for an American military presence in Honduras. In the past, I made a very detailed video all about the American military air base in Honduras, the Soto Cano Air Base. That is available on YouTube on my channel and already has more than 2,000 views, I believe. And so that has its own separate video to watch. And if you are curious and not seen that video, go ahead and scroll through my video on my channels and watch it.